At the funeral of the most feared mafia patriarch in South Korea, 63 armed killers stood in silence, and not one of them dared move when a 5-year-old girl walked through them all and took the hand of the deadliest man in the room. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when a monster realizes he still has a heart, stay until the end. This is that story. Drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The rain came down hard over Mapo district that morning, the kind of rain that doesn't apologize, that drums against rooftops and floods gutters and soaks through the finest wool without asking permission. It was the kind of morning that felt deliberate, like the sky had something to say and couldn't hold it back any longer. Kang Tae-hyun stood at the center of it all and felt nothing. He stood at the front of the funeral hall, hands clasped behind his back, jaw set, eyes fixed on the lacquered black coffin that held what remained of Cha Min-seok, patriarch, legend, father. The man who had built the Cha Kang syndicate from nothing but blood and borrowed time, who had cracked skulls and bent politicians and bought judges and buried secrets across 5 decades, who had, at the very end, died in a hospital bed smelling like antiseptic and old regret, while his only son sat in a penthouse across town and refused to answer the phone. 63 men filled the hall behind Tae-hyun. Not guests, not mourners, soldiers. Each one dressed in black, each one standing with the careful stillness of men trained to suppress every natural human impulse. The urge to shift their weight, to scratch their jaw, to exhale too loudly. They watched Tae-hyun the way wolves watch the animal that just became pack leader, assessing, measuring, waiting to see what kind of man had inherited the throne. Director Cho Sung-kyu stood near the back wall, hands folded in front of him, face arranged into an expression of appropriate grief. He was 51, lean in the way men get when ambition burns hotter than appetite, with silver threaded through his dark hair and eyes that processed everything without ever quite landing on warmth. He had served Cha Min-seok for 19 years. He had expected to guide the transition, perhaps even control it. He watched Tae-hyun's back and thought about patience. A monk at the side of the hall began to strike a ceremonial bell, low resonant strokes that moved through the room like something physical. The incense smoke thickened. Outside, rain hammered the stone steps. That was when the door at the back of the hall opened. No one heard it over the rain and the bell and the collective held breath of 63 armed men. But heads turned, one by one, a slow ripple of attention moving from the back of the room toward the front, each man tracking the same small disturbance moving between their legs. A child. She couldn't have been older than 5. Dark skin, hair pulled into 2 puffs on either side of her head, wearing a tiny white dress that had already caught rain at the hem. She moved through the hall the way children move when they are genuinely unafraid, not oblivious, but simply unbothered by the things that frightened adults. She wove between the legs of syndicate soldiers without pausing, without looking up at the hard faces above her, following some internal compass that pointed straight forward. 2 men near the aisle moved to intercept her. Instinct, training, decades of muscle memory that said unknown variables get removed. Don't. One word. Tae-hyun didn't turn around, didn't raise his voice, just said it, and both men stopped. The child reached the front of the hall and stood beside Tae-hyun. She looked up at him for a moment with large, dark eyes that held absolutely no fear. Then she reached up and took his hand. Not grabbed, not clutched. Took the way a child takes the hand of someone they already trust, easy and certain and without explanation. The bell kept ringing, the incense kept burning. 63 men stood frozen. Tae-hyun looked down at the small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers. He stared at it for a long time. Then he looked back at the coffin and said nothing and did not let go. And the ceremony continued around them like the whole world had simply accepted that this was how it was going to be now. Her name was Ari. He didn't know that yet. Maso. 3 hours later, Tae-hyun sat in the back of his car, in the underground garage beneath the Cha Kang Holdings building. Engine off, rain muffled above him, the city's noise reduced to something distant and theoretical. The funeral was finished. The coffin had been moved to the family vault. The 63 men had dispersed to their posts and their waiting and their quiet calculation. His personal secretary, a man named Im Jae-won, who had worked for the Cha family for 11 years and survived through the specific skill of being indispensable without ever becoming threatening, sat in the front seat and did not speak. He had learned early that there were moments when Tae-hyun needed absolute silence, and this was clearly one of them. On the seat beside Tae-hyun sat a sealed manila envelope. It had been handed to him after the ceremony by Cha Min-seok's personal attorney, a man who had looked gray and exhausted and faintly terrified, which was a reasonable way to look when you were handing the head of a criminal empire documents that his dead father had specifically requested not be opened until after the burial. Tae-hyun's hands rested on his knees. He looked at the envelope. He didn't touch it for a long time. His father had been dying for 14 months. There had been calls from doctors, from the family attorney, from household staff, from distant relatives he barely recognized. Tae-hyun had taken none of them. He had arranged for medical expenses to be covered. He had made sure the right people were available. He had managed it like a logistical problem rather than a human one, because that was the only way he knew how to manage it, and because going to that hospital room would have required him to look at the old man's face and feel something he had decided years ago not to feel. He picked up the envelope, opened it. There were 4 pages inside. Financial documents, wire transfer records, payment authorizations, account statements. His father's handwriting on the top sheet. Tae-hyun read it once, read it again, then sat back and looked at the concrete ceiling of the parking garage for a long time. Every month for 4 years and 9 months, 57 consecutive months, Cha Min-seok had authorized a private wire transfer of 8 million Korean won to an account registered to something called the Hanul Multicultural Children's Center in Mapo District. Anonymous. No attribution. Routed through 3 subsidiary accounts specifically to ensure it could not be traced back to the Cha family. The payments had started in late October, nearly 5 years ago, and had continued without interruption until 2 weeks before Cha Min-seok was admitted to the hospital for the final time. Below the financial records was a single handwritten note, 3 sentences. I never told you because I didn't know how to explain it. Go see what I was protecting. Try to understand it before you judge it. Tae-hyun read the 3 sentences 6 times. Then he folded the note carefully, put it in the inside breast pocket of his jacket, and said, "Find out everything there is to know about the Hanul Multicultural Children's Center in Mapo District. Director, funding, programs, history. Everything. I want it on my desk by 7 this morning." Im Jae-won said, "Yes, sir," and picked up his phone, and that was all. Tae-hyun looked out the window at the empty parking garage. He was 34 years old. He had run the syndicate's operational finances since he was 26, had taken full organizational control at 31 when his father's health first declined, and in 3 years had not once, not a single time, been surprised by a financial document. He knew every account, every shell company, every laundering route, every legitimate business front. He had not known about the Hanul Center. His father had kept a secret from him for nearly 5 years. Not a weapon, not a leverage point, not a hidden asset, a children's center. He pressed the back of his head against the headrest and closed his eyes. And somewhere in the locked chamber where he kept everything that wasn't useful, something moved. The report was on his desk by 6:45. Tae-hyun read it standing, still in his funeral clothes, jacket off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a cup of coffee going cold on the desk beside him. The office was on the 41st floor of Chakong Holdings, floor-to-ceiling glass on 2 sides, the city spread out below in its gray morning light, still wet from the rain. The Hanul Multicultural Children's Center had been operating for 6 years, founded and run by a woman named Naomi Brooks, American, 30 years old, originally from Atlanta, Georgia, had come to Seoul on an education fellowship 8 years prior and never left. The center served children from immigrant and mixed heritage families. Nigerian Korean, American Korean, Southeast Asian Korean, a range of backgrounds that fell outside the neat categories Seoul's institutions were built for. After-school programs, language tutoring, cultural workshops, weekend family events. Operated on a combination of small grants, volunteer work, and, as of 57 months ago, a monthly anonymous donation that Naomi Brooks had apparently spent 4 years trying to trace before giving up. Current enrollment, 41 children. Staff, 6 full-time, 9 volunteers. The building was a converted warehouse in the older part of Mapo, leased on a yearly contract that the center renewed in a state of chronic financial anxiety. The center's legal status was stable, but its budget existed somewhere between functional and precarious. There was a photograph in the file. Mjwan had pulled it from the center's public social media, an event photo from a family day 3 months ago. The woman in the center of it, Naomi Brooks, was laughing at something outside the frame, caught mid-movement, one hand reaching toward a child who had apparently just knocked something over. She wore a green apron. Her hair was natural, pulled back loosely. She looked completely unguarded. Taehyun studied the photograph for a moment. Then he turned the page. He also found the child. Ari. The report identified her as Ari Brooks, 5 years old, born in Seoul to an American mother who had died of complications from a rare cardiac condition when Ari was 11 months old. The father was not listed. Naomi Brooks had been named the child's emergency guardian 3 months before the mother's death, had completed a formal adoption 18 months later. Ari was Korean-American by blood, American by documentation, and apparently Naomi's daughter in every way that actually mattered. The same child who had walked through 63 armed men and taken his hand. Taehyun set the report down on the desk. He stood at the window and looked at the city. Traffic was building on the bridges below, the ordinary machinery of an ordinary morning grinding forward with complete indifference to everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. He thought about his father's handwriting. Go see what I was protecting. He thought about a small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers, easy and certain and without explanation. He picked up the report, picked up his coffee, and drank the cold coffee in 2 swallows because it was there and he needed something to do with his hands. And then he said to the empty office quietly, I'll go tomorrow. He went the next morning, alone, or as close to alone as a man in his position ever managed. 2 vehicles instead of the usual 4, 3 men instead of the usual 8, and the vehicles were unremarkable sedans rather than the black SUVs that announced his presence like a moving declaration of intent. He wore a dark coat over a simple charcoal suit, no visible jewelry, no indicators. The Hanul Center occupied the ground floor of a 3-story building on a narrow street that smelled like fried food and laundry steam. The building's exterior was painted in colors that had been cheerful once and were now faded to something quieter but not unpleasant, blue and yellow softened by weather into a kind of gentle dignity. Children's artwork covered a notice board near the front door, paper cranes, painted handprints, a banner in Korean, English, and what looked like Yoruba. Taehyun stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. Behind him, one of his men started to follow him toward the entrance. Taehyun said, "Stay with the cars," and walked in alone. The front room was organized chaos. Low tables, mismatched chairs, shelves packed with books, and craft supplies and board games with their boxes held together with rubber bands. 3 children sat at one table doing something with colored paper. An elderly Korean woman was reading aloud from a picture book at another table. The whole room smelled like crayons and rice from somewhere in the back. Nobody looked up when he walked in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, recalibrating, because this was a sensory environment he hadn't been in for approximately 30 years, and it was registering as deeply strange. A woman came through a door at the back of the room carrying a large box of art supplies and talking over her shoulder to someone he couldn't see. "Told you, put the blue temper on the lower shelf, not the upper one. Sujin can't reach the upper." She turned, saw him, and stopped. Naomi Brooks. In person, she was a little shorter than the photograph had suggested, with the kind of stillness that came not from being small, but from being self-contained. She looked at him directly, which was something many people failed to do. Most people in his presence found reasons to look slightly to the side or slightly down. An instinctive deference that had become so normal, he stopped registering it years ago. She didn't do that. "Can I help you?" she said. Her Korean was good, not perfect, but confident, the kind that came from years of daily use rather than formal study. "I'm here to speak with you," Taehyun said, "about the center." "Okay," she said, and set the box down on the nearest shelf. "I'm in the middle of something right now. You can wait over there." She pointed to a plastic chair near the window that was slightly too small for an adult and was also bright orange. He looked at the chair, then he looked at her. "I'll wait," he said. She nodded and went back through the door. He sat down in the orange chair. One of the children at the craft table looked up at him, considered him for a moment with the frank evaluative stare that children deploy without self-consciousness, and then went back to folding paper. Tae-hyun sat and waited. He could not remember the last time he had waited for anything. Naomi came back 22 minutes later. He knew because he checked his watch twice, not because he was impatient, but because the precision was a reflex. She came back without apology, pulled another chair close to his, and sat down in it the way someone sits when they're accustomed to having difficult conversations in small spaces. "You're Kang Tae-hyun," she said. Not a question. He looked at her steadily. "You know who I am. I did my homework after the funeral. Ari told me she held your hand." She said this without drama, just information. "I looked you up." And I thought about whether to file a police report and decided that was probably useless. And then I thought about whether I should be afraid. She paused. I decided that was also not particularly useful. Something moved in Tae-hyun's expression. Not a smile, but the thing that precedes a smile in people who have mostly forgotten how. "Your donor was my father. I figured that out about 10 minutes after you sat down in that chair," she said. "The anonymous transfer patterns matched your father's known charitable routing. I spent a year and a half trying to trace those payments. Once I saw your face, I put it together." She looked at him evenly. "Why are you here?" "He asked me to come and see what he was protecting." Naomi was quiet for a moment. One of the children at the far table dropped something and a small argument began over whose fault it was, and she turned toward it automatically, a quick professional assessment of whether it required intervention, and decided it didn't. When she looked back at him, something in her expression had shifted. "He was a complicated man," she said. "I never met him, but the timing of when the donations started, it was about a month after Ari's mother died. I always thought whoever it was had known her somehow." She paused. "Did he?" "I don't know yet." "Okay," she said. "What do you want from us?" "I don't know yet," he said again, and it was the truest thing he'd said out loud in recent memory. She studied him for a moment. He held the gaze because he was capable of very few things, as naturally as he was capable of holding direct eye contact under pressure. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said. "I don't want anything from you. I don't want money. I don't want protection. I don't want connections. What your father's support meant to us, it kept the lights on during 2 years where I didn't know if we'd survive. I'm grateful for that. But I'm not transferring that gratitude to you automatically. I'm not asking for gratitude." "Good. Then here are my conditions if you want to visit." She said it without blinking. "No armed men inside this building. No arriving unannounced. No using the children for photographs or influence. No trying to convert anything that happens here into leverage or publicity. If any of those conditions are broken, you don't come back." The room was quiet. The children had moved on from their argument to some new project. The elderly woman with the picture book was refilling a cup of water at a small table. Outside the window, the narrow street held its ordinary morning sounds. Tae-hyun looked at Naomi Brooks, this 30-year-old woman from Atlanta who had come to Seoul and built something out of nothing and was now sitting across from the head of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in South Korea and setting conditions for his behavior, and said, "Agreed." She nodded. "Then you can come back on Thursday. We have a STEAM activity in the afternoon. You can sit in if you want." She stood, signaled that the conversation was over, and walked back into the noise of the center. Tae-hyun sat in the orange chair for another moment. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out into the gray morning street. In the car, one of his men said carefully, "How did it go, sir?" Tae-hyun thought about the orange chair, about the condition that he not bring armed men inside, about being made to wait 22 minutes without explanation or apology. "Fine," he said. "Go." He went back on Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and the one after that. The first 3 visits were exercises in extreme internal adjustment. Tae-hyun was accustomed to environments organized around his presence, rooms that rearranged when he entered, conversations that redirected toward him, people who tracked his expressions for signals. The Hanul Center operated on a different physics. Children ran past him without acknowledgement. Naomi handed him a glue stick once and said, "Can you hold that?" and was gone before he could respond, and he stood there holding a glue stick for 4 minutes while a 7-year-old explained to him, at great length, why the butterfly she was making needed to have exactly 5 layers of tissue paper to look real. He held the glue stick. He listened about the tissue paper. He said, 5 layers. And the 7-year-old said, exactly, you get it, in the tone of someone who had finally found a peer. He started arriving a few minutes before the scheduled time and sitting in his car, which bothered him because it was not something he did, and because he could not explain to himself why the prospect of walking into that particular building generated something in his chest that functioned like anticipation, but felt unfamiliar enough that he wasn't entirely sure that's what it was. Ari appeared in his vicinity consistently, without strategy. She didn't seek him out dramatically or avoid him uncertainly. She just kept turning up near him the way children turn up near things they've quietly decided belong in their orbit. She would sit beside him during activities and narrate what she was doing without asking if he was interested. She would show him things, a drawing, a model, a book she liked, hold them up for him to look at, and then take them back and continue with her day. She called him the quiet man to the other children, which he overheard once and stored somewhere he didn't immediately examine. He watched Naomi work. He did this more than was strictly necessary for any purpose he could have named. She was good at it, not in the way of someone performing competence, but in the way of someone who had solved so many of these particular problems that her body had developed its own solutions. She could de-escalate a crying 6-year-old and simultaneously manage a supply delivery and answer a parent's phone question in a way that made each person feel like they had her full attention. She handled bureaucratic difficulties, permit renewals, grant applications, building management complaints, with a contained frustration that she burned through quickly and completely rather than carrying forward. She did not treat him as dangerous. This was remarkable enough that he thought about it. She was not performing fearlessness. She was simply not afraid, or if she was, she had quarantined the fear somewhere it didn't affect her behavior, and the distinction didn't matter because the result was the same. She spoke to him the way she spoke to the building manager and the supply delivery driver, and the parents who dropped off children, directly, without performance, as if he were simply a person who was present and needed to be talked to. He did not know what to do with this. He found that he did not want it to stop. In his real life, the other half of it, things were moving the way things always moved. There were meetings with syndicate division heads, decisions about territory disputes in Incheon, a complicated negotiation with the Japanese distribution network, the ongoing maintenance of the political relationships that kept the organization's legitimate business fronts functioning smoothly. He moved through all of it the way he always had, with the cold precision that his father had identified in him when he was 16 and said, approvingly, "You feel things too slowly to make mistakes." He had taken this as a compliment. He was no longer entirely sure it was one. Cho Seung-kyu came to him 6 weeks after the first visit with a quarterly financial report and stayed to talk about operational alignment and organizational stability, which were the kinds of words Seung-kyu used when he meant something else. He was a careful man with a careful vocabulary, and Tae-hyun had always known how to read him. "There's talk," Seung-kyu said at the end of the meeting, in the careful tone of a man delivering something unwelcome as a gift. Among the senior directors, about the visits. Tae-hyun looked up from the financial report. What talk? Concern. Some of the men feel that the optics in particular, an outside location, uncontrolled environment, association with, he paused, chose his words, with individuals from communities that are not typically part of our operational sphere. Speak plainly, Seung-kyu. There is a perception, Seung-kyu said, that you have become personally attached to the center, to the woman who runs it. There are questions about judgment. The room was quiet. Tae-hyun set the financial report down. Who's asking these questions? He said. It's diffuse. Concern that's emerged organically among who? Seung-kyu met his gaze. Multiple senior directors. I'm conveying a collective concern. Then convey this back to the collective, Tae-hyun said. My personal activities are not subject to syndicate review. My judgment is not under question, and if I find out that diffuse organic concern is in fact organized deliberate pressure, I will find it extremely interesting to know who organized it. He picked the report back up. That's all. Seung-kyu left. Tae-hyun watched the door close and held the financial report without reading it. He had been aware for 3 weeks that someone in his organization was watching his movements more closely than routine security required. Small signs. A vehicle he recognized twice too many in the Mapo area, a question in a weekly briefing that was slightly more specific about his whereabouts than the briefer needed to be. He had filed this information in the part of his mind where he kept things he was not yet ready to act on. He filed Seong-kyu's visit there too. He put it beside the other things and looked at them together for a moment. Then he went back to the financial report because he was who he was, and the organization ran on his attention whether he felt like giving it or not. On a Thursday in the 6th week, he arrived at the center to find the front door propped open and Naomi in the small kitchen at the back, standing over a pot of something that smelled like ginger and coconut, arguing quietly with a phone she'd propped against a box of kitchen supplies. I understand what the assessment says, but the assessment was done by someone who has clearly never actually been in this building, because if they had been in this building, they would know that the ventilation issue is in the back room, not the... No, that's not what I... She looked up, saw Tae-hyun in the doorway, and held up one finger. He leaned against the doorframe and waited. The call lasted 4 more minutes. He listened to half of a bureaucratic dispute about a building safety assessment with the same focused attention he gave to intelligence briefings, because it was the same cognitive activity, extracting relevant information from a stream of words, identifying the actual problem beneath the stated problem, calculating paths forward. When she hung up, she looked at him with the expression she wore when things were annoying her, a specific compression of the area around her eyes that he had cataloged somewhere in the past few weeks without consciously deciding to. Building management, she said. The safety assessment came back with a flag on the ventilation in the children's activity room, which is fine. It's a real issue. I know it's a real issue, but their proposed timeline and their proposed cost are... She stopped. You don't need to hear about this. Tell me the actual problem, he said. She looked at him. Why? Because you spend energy on problems that have available solutions, and I find that inefficient. That's a very warm way to put it, she said. The actual problem, he repeated. She set down the wooden spoon she'd been holding. Building management wants us to hire their preferred contractor, who's going to charge 3 times the market rate and take 6 weeks to do a job that could be done in 4 days. In the meantime, they're using the assessment flag to threaten our occupancy permit. Who owns the building? She named a property management company. He knew it, a mid-sized firm that operated in Mapo and Yongsan, not directly connected to anything in his organizational sphere but adjacent to several business relationships. Give me the assessment document, he said. Tae-hyun. I'm not going to do anything to anyone, he said. Give me the document. She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable, then reached into a folder on the counter and handed him a 2-page form. He read it in approximately 90 seconds. The flag was technically valid, but the remediation specifications were excessive, the kind of excessive that happened when an assessor was working from a specific interest. This contractor, he said, and named the company listed in the building manager's recommendation. Yes? They're a subsidiary of a holding company that manages several properties in this district. The assessor and the contractor are almost certainly financially affiliated. This is a standard pressure play. Manufacture a compliance issue, control the remediation, extract the margin. He handed the document back. Get an independent assessment from a licensed firm, not one recommended by building management. Document everything. File a formal objection within 14 days to preserve your legal standing. She stared at him. I was in corporate finance for 6 years before I ran the organization, he said. This isn't complicated. You were in corporate finance, she repeated. Syndicate finance has significant overlap with legitimate corporate finance. The manipulation strategies are identical. She looked at him for another moment, and then, unexpectedly, she laughed. A short, real sound, involuntary. Okay, she said, that's actually useful. I'm aware. She picked the wooden spoon back up, turned toward the pot. You want to stay for lunch? The kids eat at noon. He should not stay for lunch. There were 3 meetings scheduled for his afternoon and a report that needed his signature before 3 o'clock. Yes, he said. He ate lunch at a table that came up to his mid-thigh, surrounded by 11 children who were largely indifferent to his existence except for Ari, who climbed into the chair beside him, arranged her rice and soup with great care, and then looked up and said, You're not scared of anything. He looked at her. What makes you think that? You sit still, she said. Scared people move around a lot. He thought about this. I'm scared of some things, he said, which was the first time he had said that sentence, in any form, in approximately a decade. Ari considered this with the serious evaluative attention that she brought to most things. That's okay, she said. My mom is scared of cockroaches. She picked up her spoon, even though she's brave. Tae-hyun looked across the table to where Naomi was cutting something for a younger child, her attention entirely elsewhere, and something settled in his chest that he couldn't name and didn't try to, and the lunch continued around him with its noise and its small disasters and its complete indifference to anything happening in the rest of Seoul. It was Im Jae-won who brought him the news about the real estate consortium 3 weeks later, in the calm procedural tone of a man delivering information he knew would matter. Daesong Urban Development, a consortium of 3 real estate investment firms with heavy connections to several of Seoul's largest commercial developers, had filed an application with the Mapo District Municipal Office to rezone the block containing the Hanul Center building, along with 4 surrounding properties, for large-scale commercial development. The application cited urban renewal priorities and projected economic development value. It was thorough, professionally prepared, and, Jae-won noted carefully, appeared to have moved through the preliminary review stage with unusual speed. Tae-hyun read the summary. Then he asked for the full filing. He read the full filing in 40 minutes, then set it down and sat in his office without moving for a longer time than he usually permitted himself. The filing was the ventilation play at scale. The consortium's attorneys had structured the application to initiate an automatic review of all current tenancies in the affected block, which would trigger a notification to the Hanul Center's current lease, which, because it was a year-to-year arrangement, had no protections against development displacement. The timeline projected 18 months from initial filing to mandatory vacancy. The legal structure was legitimate. It was also the most efficient possible mechanism for removing Naomi's center from its current location in a way that would be extremely difficult to fight. He could end this phone call. He knew the names of 3 men who sat on the Mapo District Municipal Review Board and owed the organization favors of varying magnitude. 1 call, 1 reference, and the application would be quietly buried or indefinitely delayed. He did not make the call. He sat with that decision for a full evening, which was not something he typically did. He tested it from multiple angles. He examined the impulse and tried to determine whether it was principled or merely performing principle for an audience of 1. The conclusion he arrived at reluctantly was that Naomi wouldn't want it. Not because she didn't understand the world, she clearly understood a great deal about the world, but because the thing she had built at the center was built on an independence that mattered to her beyond its practical value. Rescuing it through leverage would change it. Not for the children, not necessarily even for the center, but for her and for whatever was developing between them, which he had not yet assigned a name to because naming it felt like a step he would not be able to take back. There were other ways. He called a law firm, not one connected to the organization, but one he knew to be genuinely excellent and strategically aggressive, and arranged for them to be available as consultants on a zoning dispute for a small nonprofit in Mapo District. He structured the arrangement so that if Naomi engaged them, the cost would be covered through a nonprofit legal defense fund that the firm maintained. He was not listed anywhere in the arrangement. Then he went to the center on Thursday and sat beside Ari while she taught him to fold a paper crane, which took 45 minutes because his hands were not made for this, and he had to start over 3 times. And Ari was a patient teacher who said, "You're doing fine," in a way that sounded exactly like something she had learned from Naomi. And when he finally produced something that approximated a crane, she held it up and said, "It's a little smushed." And he said, "Yes." And she said, "But you can see what it is." And he said, "That's enough." And she decided this was satisfactory and moved on to a new project, leaving him holding the paper crane in both hands. He took it with him when he left. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, next to his father's handwritten note, and he did not examine why. He found out about the surveillance on a Thursday morning. It came from an unexpected source. One of his men who managed General Security Intelligence had picked up a subcontracted observation operation running in the Mapo area, professional but not syndicate affiliated, using a rotating 3-person team and a vehicle change every 4 days. Standard middle-tier corporate surveillance. The observation targets, confirmed through a secondary intercept, were Naomi Brooks and the Hanol Center building. His man delivered this information with the specific, careful neutrality of someone who understood that the content was dangerous. Tae-hyun read the surveillance report in the car outside the center, engine running. Thursday morning activity sounds filtering through the closed windows. He sat with the information. He turned it over. He laid it alongside everything else he'd been accumulating over the past 2 months. Seung-kyu's careful words about collective concern, the unusual speed of the consortium's zoning application, the technical flag on the building assessment that had preceded it, and now a private surveillance operation targeting the one person he had visited consistently and who could not be easily explained away by operational necessity. The picture assembled itself the way pictures always assembled themselves, not in a single moment of revelation, but in a slow accumulating weight of evidence that eventually became undeniable. Seung-kyu. He couldn't prove it yet. The surveillance operation was subcontracted through 2 intermediary firms, which was exactly how a careful man with access to syndicate operational budgets would structure it. The consortium application had moved through municipal review with unusual speed, which was exactly the outcome a careful man with 19 years of political relationship building could arrange. The ventilation assessment flag had arrived 6 weeks after Seung-kyu became aware of his visits, which was exactly the timing of a man who was testing pressure strategies while he built towards something larger. Tae-hyun could feel the shape of it. He could not yet hold it in his hands. He put the report in his inside pocket, next to the paper crane and his father's note, and sat for a moment with the particular coldness that settled in him when things required his complete attention. Not anger, nothing so reactive as anger, but something cleaner and more total, an alignment of every cognitive capacity toward a single problem. Then he got out of the car and walked into the center. Naomi was standing in the front room with a letter in her hand, and she looked up when he came through the door, and the expression on her face told him she'd already opened whatever had arrived this morning. "Tell me," he said. She held up the letter. "The building," she said. "We got formal notification. Daesong Urban Development has filed for rezoning on our block. Our lease—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Our lease has 30 days to respond, or we're considered non-objecting parties to the displacement proceeding." From across the room, Ari looked up from the table where she'd been drawing, reading Naomi's face the way children read the faces of the adults they depend on, and her small expression went careful. Tae-hyun looked at the letter. Then he looked at Naomi. Then he looked at Ari, who was watching him from across the room with those large, steady eyes. He thought about a small hand taking his at a funeral. He thought about a paper crane that was a little smushed, but you could see what it was. "Sit down," he said to Naomi. "Let me see it." She handed him the letter. He read it. He read it again. He set it down on the table and looked at her and said, "I know someone. A law firm. They're very good, and they owe nothing to anyone connected to this filing. Tae-hyun. They do pro bono work for nonprofits through a legal defense fund. It's legitimate. I'm not pulling strings." He paused. "I'm telling you about a resource that exists." She looked at him for a long time. Something moved in her expression, the careful weighing of a woman who had survived by trusting her own judgment and knew exactly what she was doing when she trusted something else instead. "Okay," she said. "Give me the contact information." He wrote it down on a piece of paper from the front desk, in his actual handwriting, and handed it to her. Their hands did not quite touch. Outside, the narrow street held its ordinary sounds. Inside, Ari had gone back to her drawing, but she was watching him from under her lashes with the quiet attention of a child who knows something important is happening even if she doesn't know what. Tae-hyun walked out into the street and got back in the car and told his driver to go. And as the car pulled away, he was already thinking about financial records, shell companies, subsidiary structures, political donation histories, the deep architecture of a careful man's hidden ledger. There would be a great deal of information to find. He was going to find all of it. What he did not yet know, what he would not find out until the following week, at a dinner at the center when one of the older volunteers let something slip that Naomi had been holding back about a day that had happened nearly 5 years ago, about a man who had come to the center and sat in the back and watched the children play. and then walked outside and stood against the wall in the alley and pressed the back of his fist against his mouth while his shoulders shook, was that his father had been here. Not just sent money, been here. Had stood in this building and watched these children and felt something break open in him that had apparently been sealed shut for so long that the opening of it caused a physical reaction he couldn't contain in public. That was the information that was still coming. That was the thing that would change him in a way the financial records and the surveillance reports and the mounting evidence against Seong-kyu could not. But right now, in this car, moving through the late morning traffic of Mapo district, Tae-hyun looked out the window and thought about a letter with a 30-day clock on it, and a woman who had built something worth protecting with her own hands, and a little girl who thought scared people moved around a lot. And the voice in him that he kept very quiet said, not her, not them, whatever it costs. He just didn't know yet how much it was going to cost, or who was going to try to make him pay it. The law firm's name was Park & Co. Associates, and Naomi called them on a Monday morning from the small office at the back of the center with the door closed, and Ari at school, and the volunteer staff handling the morning reading program without her. She had the contact information Tae-hyun had written on the piece of notepaper in front of her, and she stared at it for a full 3 minutes before she dialed. The call lasted 40 minutes. When she came out of the office, her face was composed in the specific way it got when she had processed something difficult and filed it in the functional category rather than the emotional one. She told the volunteer coordinator that they had legal support for the zoning dispute, said it like it was ordinary, and went back to work. She did not call Tae-hyun to thank him. He noted the absence and understood it correctly. He was tracking the consortium filing from his end through his own channels. Not interference, not pressure, just information. He had a forensic accountant on his payroll whose official function was legitimate corporate audit work, and whose unofficial function was finding things inside financial structures that people had tried to hide. He put her on Daesong Urban Development without explanation. She didn't ask for one. She sent him a preliminary report 4 days later that confirmed what he already suspected. The consortium's capital structure included a series of investment vehicles that traced through 2 layers of intermediary holding companies back to accounts connected to Cho Seong-kyu's personal financial network. He read the report at 10 at night in his office, and then he put it in a locked drawer and sat in the dark for a while. He was building a case. He needed it to be complete before he moved, because an incomplete case against Seong-kyu, a man who had spent 19 years learning the organization's pressure points, would give Seong-kyu time to respond, and Tae-hyun did not want to give him time to respond. He wanted the floor to disappear entirely, and all at once. So he waited. He continued the Thursday visits. He watched the legal case develop through the law firm's updates, which Naomi forwarded to him without comment. And he watched Naomi fight the rezoning through public channels, parent meetings, a letter campaign, a meeting with a district council representative, with the focused energy of someone who had decided that losing was not an available outcome. He watched her and felt something that was becoming increasingly difficult to file under any category he had previously used. It was Seong-kyu who forced the timeline. The meeting was called for a Thursday morning. A full syndicate financial review, all senior directors required, starting at 9. Tae-hyun took his seat at the head of the table in the Chakang Holdings conference room and registered immediately that the room had a specific quality of arranged tension, the kind that happened when multiple people had talked to each other before walking in and had agreed on something. 8 men around the table. Seong-kyu at the far end, hands folded, face correct. The financial review ran for 40 minutes. Numbers, projections, operational summaries, the normal machinery. Tae-hyun moved through it at his standard pace, asked the questions that needed asking, approved what needed approval. Nothing in his expression changed. When it was done, nobody moved to leave. He waited. Director Han Sung-jin, the oldest man in the room, a syndicate member since before Tae-hyun was born, who had survived 4 internal power transitions through the specific skill of reading which way things were going before they got there, cleared his throat. "There's a secondary matter," he said, and his voice had the weighted quality of a man reading from a script he hadn't written. "Go ahead," Tae-hyun said. "Several of us have concerns about organizational stability." Han looked at the table, specifically regarding external associations that may create exposure. There is a perception that certain personal involvements have reached a point where they represent a measurable operational risk. Silence. 7 men not looking directly at Tae-hyun. One man, Seung-kyu, looking at him with the patient attention of someone watching for a specific reaction. Tae-hyun said, "Say what you're saying." Han said, "The visits to the center in Mapo. The woman. People are watching how you spend your time and drawing conclusions about where your attention is." "And where do they think my attention is?" Nobody answered. "I'll ask directly," Tae-hyun said, and his voice dropped a register that everyone in the room recognized. "Is anyone at this table suggesting that my judgment is compromised?" Han looked at his hands. The man to Tae-hyun's left found something interesting about the wall. 3 men across the table maintained very careful neutral expressions. Seung-kyu said, "No one is questioning your judgment. We're expressing concern about perception. External perception can become internal reality if it's allowed to develop unchecked." It was a good answer. Smooth, deniable, framed as loyalty. Tae-hyun had known Seung-kyu for 15 years and could hear the seams in it, the places where the words had been selected rather than said, but the seams were tight and he couldn't grip them yet. "I appreciate the concern," Tae-hyun said. "My personal activities will continue to be my personal activities. If anyone has specific intelligence suggesting an operational security risk, bring it to me with documentation and I will evaluate it. Perception without evidence is not a basis for organizational policy." He looked around the table, one face at a time. "Is there anything else?" There wasn't. The men left. Seung-kyu was the last to stand, and he paused before he moved toward the door. "I want you to know, this came from genuine concern," he said. "The men respect you. They don't want to see you damaged by something that could be managed quietly." Tae-hyun looked at him. "I know you mean that, Seung-kyu." He said it the way you say something that is technically true and carries zero warmth, and Seung-kyu heard both of those things and nodded and left. Tae-hyun sat alone in the conference room for 3 minutes. Then he called his forensic accountant and said, "I need the complete picture, whatever it takes. 2 weeks." He went to the center that afternoon instead of Thursday. He told himself it was because his schedule had shifted. He knew that was only partially true. Naomi was in the back room with 2 volunteers, reorganizing a storage system that had apparently reached critical failure. Boxes stacked in configurations that suggested accumulated crisis rather than design. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and her expression did a thing it had started doing recently. A very brief, almost imperceptible settling, like she'd had a thread of tension and it had released slightly at seeing him. He didn't think she was aware she did it. "You're not Thursday," she said. "My schedule changed." She looked at him more carefully. She'd gotten better at reading his face in the past 2 months, or maybe he'd become less careful about what he let show in her presence, and he wasn't sure which of those was actually happening. "What's wrong?" "Nothing operational." That's not the same as nothing. He looked at the storage chaos around them. "I'll help with this." "You don't have to." "I know." He took off his jacket, hung it on a hook near the door, rolled his sleeves. The 2 volunteers stared at him with identical expressions of baffled uncertainty. He picked up a box and said, "Where does this go?" They reorganized the storage room for an hour. It was purely physical work, which he needed, and it was organized by a logic he could follow. Naomi's system, once he understood it, was efficient and specific and completely her, and it required just enough focused attention that the conference room receded to a manageable distance. Ari came back from school in the middle of it, dropped her bag by the door, assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds, and decided to help by handing people things and offering opinions on organizational decisions that nobody had asked for. She handed Tae-hyun a box of art supplies and said, "That goes on the 3rd shelf on the left." And he put it there without question, and she said, "Good," in the tone of a very small project manager. When the room was done, Naomi sent the volunteers home and made tea and brought it to the front room where Tae-hyun had sat down in the not quite large enough orange chair that had somehow become his chair over the past months. Ari had fallen asleep on the small couch in the corner with a book open on her chest, which happened with enough regularity that there was a blanket folded on the arm of the couch, specifically for this purpose. Naomi sat across from him and didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, the street noise had settled into its evening register, quieter and more specific. Tell me something about your father, she said. Something you actually remember. Not the organization, not the patriarch. Him. He looked at her. Why? Because you've been sitting with something since you came in, and I think it has more to do with him than with whatever happened at work today. He was quiet. She waited, which she was very good at. Not pressuring silence, just holding space for it. He used to make doenjang jigai on Sunday mornings, he said finally, before any of the household staff arrived. I'd come downstairs and he'd be standing at the stove in a t-shirt, and he'd hand me a bowl without turning around, like I was supposed to be there, like it was the most normal thing in the world. He paused. By the time I was 16, the staff arrived early enough that it stopped. Or maybe I stopped coming downstairs. He looked at the sleeping Ari. I don't remember which. Naomi wrapped both hands around her tea. The center has been getting calls, she said. Formal inquiry calls. Questions about our operational compliance, our grant documentation, our fire safety certification. She said it without drama, just facts. They're not random. Someone is building a file. I know. Her eyes came up fast. You know. I know who's doing it. I don't have everything I need to stop it yet. The air in the room changed. Tae Hyun. Her voice had gone to the direct register, the one she used when she was done with surrounding material and needed to get to the center of something. Are we in danger, Ari and I? He met her eyes and did not look away. There is surveillance on this building. I have people monitoring it. The surveillance is informational right now. They're building pressure, not planning action. But, he stopped. But I want you to be aware. I want you to vary your routines. Don't be predictable about your times. Don't, he stopped again, differently this time. His jaw tightened. I should have moved faster. She set her tea down. Don't do that. What? The thing where you take responsibility for something you couldn't have controlled. I've watched you do that with decisions your father made 20 years ago. You weren't running the organization when he made choices that created whatever's coming at us now. You're doing what you can with what you have. He looked at her. He opened his mouth and closed it again, and something about that, the fact that she had made him not have words, which happened to him essentially never, crossed his face briefly before he controlled it. There's more, he said, about my father and this place. He hesitated, and the hesitation was visible, which meant he was letting it be visible. Someone told me, one of your older volunteers at the dinner last week. She said a man came here about 5 years ago, sat in the back, watched the children, then left, and he stopped. Naomi was watching him with complete stillness. Cried, he said. The word came out like he was setting something down that had been heavy. She said he stood in the alley and cried. Hansi mentioned him to me once, Naomi said quietly. She said she didn't know who he was, that he came back twice more and then stopped coming. She thought he might have lost a child. He didn't lose a child, Taehyun said. He had one. One he spent 30 years preparing to inherit a criminal empire, and somewhere in the last 5 years of his life, he came here and watched other people's children, and he stopped. His voice had gone flat in the way it went when he was controlling something with considerable effort. And I didn't answer the phone. The room was quiet. Ari's breathing was slow and even on the small couch. He left you the note, Naomi said. He sent you here. I know. That was his version of Sunday morning doenjang jjigae. She said it simply. It was the thing he knew how to do. Something moved in Taehyun's face. He looked at the window. Outside the narrow street held its evening sounds, ordinary and indifferent, the city going about its business with complete unconcern for anything happening in this room. He said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. When have I not? If I had to make a move against the man responsible for this, against the person building the case against your center, it's going to be internal. It's going to be done inside my organization. Some of it will not be legal, in the traditional sense. He looked at her steadily. Knowing that, do you want me to continue? The silence that followed was the most specific silence he had experienced since the funeral. I'm not going to tell you to do something illegal, she said. That's not an answer. I know. She looked at Ari, then she looked back at him. I trust you to make the decision you would make regardless of whether I was in the picture. I trust that the decision you would make regardless of me would be the same one you'll make now." She paused. "That's not the same as asking you to do it, but it's also not asking you to stop." He nodded. Once. And she understood that the conversation was complete. He got up and put his jacket back on. Ari stirred on the couch, blinked at him, said, "You're leaving," in the thick voice of someone not quite awake. "Yes," he said. She considered this. "Okay," she said, and closed her eyes again. He walked to the door. Naomi walked with him, and at the threshold she said quietly, so it didn't carry, "Be careful. Whatever you're doing, be careful." He didn't say anything back. He nodded and stepped out into the evening street and kept walking. And halfway to the car, his phone buzzed with a message from his forensic accountant. "Found something. Not 2 weeks. Come now." He walked faster. The city moved around him with its noise and its light and its complete indifference. And somewhere in the Cha Kong Holdings building, Cho Seung-kyu was sitting in his corner office doing whatever careful men do in the hours before everything they built begins to come. The forensic accountant's name was Yoon Mi-rai, and she worked out of a small office on the 14th floor of a building in Yoido that had no signage on the door and no record in the Cha Kong organizational chart. She was 43, precise, and had the specific emotional flatness of someone who had spent 20 years looking at financial crime and had long since stopped being surprised by what people did with money when they thought no one was watching. She was surprised now. Taehyun could tell because she met him at the elevator instead of waiting at her desk, which she had never done in 6 years of working for him, and her face had the compressed quality of someone holding something in with both hands. "Show me," he said, before she could speak. She showed him. The conference table was covered in printed documents, account statements, wire transfer records, corporate registration filings, a series of organizational charts she had drawn by hand because the structure was complex enough that the software kept producing charts too large to read on a single screen. She walked him through it methodically, the way she always did, starting from the outer edges and moving inward. Seung-kyu's financial network was larger than Taehyun had estimated, much larger. The man had been building it for 11 years, not 9, not since Taehyun took operational control, but 11, meaning he had started during the last healthy years of Cha Min-seok's leadership, which meant either that Min-seok had not known, or that he had known and had chosen to manage it quietly rather than confront it. Taehyun filed that question in the back of his mind and kept listening. The structure ran through 14 shell companies across 4 jurisdictions. At its center was a holding entity registered in Singapore that controlled 2 investment vehicles in Seoul, 3 in Hong Kong, and a series of real estate development interests that connected. And here Mi-rai paused and tapped the organizational chart with one finger, directly to Daesong Urban Development. Taehyun looked at the chart. "He built the consortium." "He didn't build it," Mi-rai said. "He owns it. Through 4 layers of intermediary holding companies, Daesong Urban Development is 72% controlled by capital that traces to Seung-kyu's Singapore entity. The other 28% is institutional investment that has no idea who the beneficial owner is." She moved her finger to another section of the chart. "He's also been siphoning from the syndicate's legitimate business accounts, not large amounts individually, between 3 and 8 million one per transaction, routed as standard operational expenses, but consistently over 11 years. She paused. "The total is 4.3 billion won." The room was quiet. 4.3 billion, Taehyun said. "Conservative estimate. There may be additional structures I haven't found yet." He looked at the chart. He looked at the number. He stood there in Mi-rai's small office with the city spread out through the window behind her and processed, with methodical completeness, the full scope of what he was looking at. 11 years. The entire duration of his own involvement in the organization's finances, which meant that for 6 years from the time he took over operational financial management until this moment, he had been reviewing accounts that Seung-kyu was manipulating, and he had not seen it. He had not seen it. "The routing method," he said. "Legitimate expense codes. He used real vendors, real transactions, as cover, then created parallel transactions of similar amounts through the same vendors routed to the intermediary accounts. The discrepancies are in the decimal level rounding differences. You would only find them if you were looking specifically for them. She said this without inflection. She was not absolving him and she was not indicting him. She was just telling him the method. He nodded once. How long to compile a complete evidentiary package? If I work through the weekend, 72 hours. Work through the weekend? She nodded. He picked up his jacket, which he had set on the chair when he came in, and then he set it back down because there was one more question. The surveillance on the Hanul Center, he said. The subcontracted team in Mapo. Can you connect it to his network? Mireille pulled a single page from a separate stack. Already did. The surveillance firm is owned by a company that shares a registered agent with one of Seongkyu's domestic shell entities. It's not direct, but it's documentable. Taehyun picked up his jacket and left. In the elevator going down, he stood with his hands at his sides and breathed carefully and did not move. The elevator opened into the building lobby. He walked through it and out into the cold night air of Yeouido and got into the back of the waiting car and said, "Drive." And his driver drove, and he sat in the moving dark and let himself feel, for exactly 4 minutes, the full weight of what Mirai had just shown him. 11 years. A man he had known for 15. A man who had sat in his father's conference rooms and his own, who had attended the funeral and stood with the correct expression of grief, who had delivered concerns about collective perception with the careful voice of a loyal subordinate. 11 years of parallel construction, parallel theft, parallel scheming, running beneath the surface of everything Tae-hyun thought he knew about his own organization. He had not seen it. At the end of 4 minutes, he stopped feeling it and started working with it, which was the transition he had learned to make at 16 and had never stopped making since. And he took out his phone and began making notes. The closure order arrived on a Tuesday. Naomi called him. She didn't usually call. She texted, brief and factual, the communication style of someone who conserved direct contact for things that required it. When his phone showed her name, he knew before he answered. They filed for emergency closure, she said. Her voice was controlled but tight in the way of someone who had been controlled for a long time already. Fabricated safety violations, the fire suppression system, the structural load assessment, the ventilation, all three flagged simultaneously in a new municipal inspection that nobody scheduled and nobody told me was happening. The inspector showed up this morning with a city seal and a clipboard and 30 minutes later handed me a notice. Taehyun was already standing. He had been in a meeting and he had walked out of it mid-sentence, which he did not do, and he was now in the hallway outside the conference room. When's the closure date? 72 hours, unless I can get a legal challenge filed that creates a stay. Her breath came through the phone, short and tight. Park and Seo are already on it. They think they can get the stay, but they need 48 hours to build the filing, and the window is... It's close. It's very close. A pause. Taehyun. There are 41 kids in this program. Some of them have nowhere else. I know. Don't tell me you're going to fix it. I'm not going to tell you that. Then what? I'm going to tell you that Park and Seo are good enough to get the stay if the filing is clean. Let them work. Give them everything they ask for without waiting to be asked twice. He paused. And I need to know. Did the inspector give you a name? She gave him the name. He knew the inspector. Not personally, but the name was in the file Mireille had been building. A municipal employee whose name appeared twice in the documented connection between Seongkyu's network and the Mapo District Regulatory Office. He put the name in his notes and said, "Thank you." That's all? That's all I need right now. A long beat. Ari knows something is wrong. She hasn't asked me directly, but she's been very quiet since this morning, and she's been drawing the same thing over and over, the front of the building with all the kids in front of it. I don't know what to tell her. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Tell her the building isn't going anywhere. You don't know that yet. No, he said, but it's what she needs to hear right now, and I'm going to make it true. He hung up and turned around and walked back into the conference room and said, "I need the room." And the 4 men in it looked at his face and got up and left without asking why. He closed the door. He sat down in the empty room and spread his notes across the table and looked at the shape of what he had. Mireille had 72 hours to finish the evidentiary package. The legal stay needed 48 hours. The closure order was 72 hours. The numbers fit, if nothing else moved. He called Mirai. I need the inspector documentation prioritized. Everything connecting Park Chulho to Seongkyu's network, documented and formatted for legal submission by tomorrow morning. A pause on her end. I can do that. But it compresses the rest of the timeline. Do the inspector first. She hung up without acknowledging the order, which was her equivalent of yes. He made 2 more calls. One to Park and Seo to let them know documentation was coming that would support a corruption argument in the stay filing. One to his head of security to double the monitoring on the Hanul Center building for the next 72 hours. Then he sat in the empty conference room and looked at the wall. He was 4 hours from the next move when his phone buzzed with a message from a number he didn't recognize. Check your personal email. The account you use for nothing. Open it now. He stared at the message, then he opened the email account, a private address, unconnected to any Cha Kong system that he used for perhaps 6 contacts in the world. There was one new email. No subject line, sent 40 minutes ago. Inside was a single video file. He plugged in his earphones and pressed play. The footage was surveillance quality, slightly grainy, a fixed camera angle on what appeared to be a parking structure. Timestamp from 9 days ago. 2 men standing beside a vehicle in the low yellow light of the structure, their faces clear enough. One was Cho Seung-kyu. The other was director Han Sung-jin, the oldest man in the room at the financial review, the man who had cleared his throat and read from his mental script about organizational stability and external associations. Tae-hyun watched the video. There was no audio. But the exchange was clear enough. An envelope passed from Seung-kyu to Han. Han opening it briefly and closing it, the handshake that followed, the particular body language of 2 men who had concluded an agreement. He watched it twice, 3 times. The 4th time, he paused it on Han's face at the moment he opened the envelope, the expression of a man receiving payment, the specific micro-expression of someone who has crossed a line and decided to be comfortable about it. Han, 26 years in the organization, a man who had attended every significant syndicate event Tae-hyun could remember from childhood, a man who had served under his father. He put the phone face down on the table. He sat very still, the kind of still that came not from calm but from the concentration of every reactive impulse into a single point of pressure that had nowhere to go yet. Who had sent the video? That was the question that cut through everything else. Someone had surveillance footage of Seung-kyu and Han from 9 days ago, had kept it, and had sent it to his private account at the exact moment when the closure order created maximum pressure. That was not coincidence. That was a move. Someone inside the organization was watching Seung-kyu independently. Someone who had chosen this moment to put information in Tae-hyun's hands, not earlier, not later. Someone who was managing a timeline. He called him Jae-won. I need to know who sent me a video to my personal email 40 minutes ago. I need to know within 2 hours. Jae-won said, carefully, the personal account? Yes. I'll start now. He could hear Jae-won processing, the background sound of his keyboard already. Sir, is this connected to the Seung-kyu matter? Yes. Then I should tell you something. A man named Lee Byung-ho has been trying to reach you for 3 days. He's one of Seung-kyu's mid-level operational managers, runs the Northern District accounts. He's been asking through unofficial channels, not the organization's systems. He's told 2 people that he has something and that he wants to talk to you directly. Tae-hyun stood up. Get him to me, tonight, here. He paused. Quietly, Lee Byung-ho arrived at 9:45, escorted by 2 of Tae-hyun's personal security who had collected him from a restaurant in Mapo, where he'd apparently been waiting for 3 hours. He was 36, mid-level management in every physical sense. Unremarkable face, careful clothing, the practiced invisibility of a man who had learned that the safest place in an organization was below the line of notice. He sat across from Tae-hyun and laced his fingers together on the table and breathed in the specific way of someone managing fear. You wanted to reach me, Tae-hyun said. Yes, sir. You have something. Yes, sir. Lee reached into his jacket, slowly, with the deliberate telegraphing of someone very aware that there were armed men in the room, and produced a USB drive. He set it on the table between them. Audio files. 18 months of recordings from Director Cho's office. I installed the device myself. He doesn't know. Tae-hyun looked at the USB drive. He looked at Lee. Why? Lee pressed his lips together. Because 14 months ago, Seung-kyu told me to alter the Northern District account records in a specific way. I understood what he was doing. I understood what I was being made complicit in. He paused. I have a daughter. She's 7. I started recording because I needed something that wasn't just my word against his, if it ever... He stopped. His jaw worked. If everything went wrong. You sent me the parking structure footage. Yes, sir. You've had this for 18 months. Yes, sir. The room was very quiet. Taehyun looked at the USB drive for a long moment. Then he picked it up. You understand what happens now, he said, if what's on this is what you say it is. Yes, Lee said. I understand. You're not going back to your regular position. You'll be moved tonight, somewhere outside Seung-kyu's operational awareness. He stood. You did the right thing. That doesn't mean it becomes easy from here. Lee looked at the table. How long has he been planning to take control? 11 years, Taehyun said. Lee closed his eyes. Taehyun left the room and went directly to Mirai's office. He handed her the USB drive and said, add this to the package. Everything. Make it complete, make it airtight, and make it ready for a full council presentation. He looked at his watch. It was 10:15. I'm calling an emergency council session for Thursday morning. Mirai took the drive. That's 36 hours. I know. The closure order closes in 58 hours. I know that too. She looked at him. You're going to do both at the same time. Yes. She turned to her computer without another word. He left and walked down the hallway toward the elevator and pulled out his phone and stood in the corridor and called the one person he called now when he needed something that wasn't strategy or intelligence or logistical precision. Naomi answered on the second ring. The center is going to be okay, he said. I don't have everything in place yet, but the direction is set, and I need you to trust that for the next 36 hours. A silence. What are you going to do? Handle it my way. He paused. I told you when I started this that some of it wouldn't be legal in the traditional sense. That's still true. I need you to know that and still, He stopped. Still what? Still be there on Thursday afternoon. He said it and waited. Another silence, longer. He heard her breathing. He heard faintly the sound of the center's building settling in whatever way old buildings settle at night. We'll be there, she said. He hung up. He stood in the hallway for a moment with his phone at his side. 36 hours. 58 hours on the closure order, 36 on the council session, and somewhere inside those numbers, the entire architecture that Seung-kyu had built over 11 years was going to come down. Not through violence, not through the crude tools that the organization had always used for internal discipline, but through the thing that the man had apparently never considered Tae-hyun capable of: patience, precision, and the willingness to let evidence do what force couldn't. But there was still the question that had been sitting underneath everything since Mirai's office. The one he had not examined fully because examining it fully required looking at something he didn't want to look at. He had not seen it. 4.3 billion won, 11 years, 14 shell companies, and he had not seen it. And now he had to stand in front of the full syndicate council and expose Seung-kyu's crimes while simultaneously standing on his own record as the man who had managed these finances and he did not sleep. He sat at the long table in his office with Mi-rae's documents spread across every surface and Lee Byung-ho's audio files running through his earphones one file at a time. And he worked through the night the way he had learned to work through the nights that mattered, without urgency in his body, because urgency in the body produced errors, but with a completeness of attention that left no room for anything else. Coffee went cold beside him. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows went dark, and then began, around 4 in the morning, to turn the specific gray that preceded dawn in Seoul, the color of concrete reconsidering itself. The audio files were extraordinary. Seung-kyu's voice on the recordings was different from the voice Tae-hyun had known across 15 years of meetings and briefings and careful conversations. In the recordings, he was looser, more direct, the vocabulary of careful deniability replaced by the language of a man operating in what he believed was absolute privacy. He talked about timelines. He talked about the council members he had approached and the ones he was still working. He talked about Tae-hyun, referred to him consistently as the boy, which landed somewhere in Tae-hyun. Hyun's chest with a cold, specific weight that he noted and set aside. He talked about the center in Mapo in terms that were purely instrumental: a pressure point, a vulnerability, a mechanism for demonstrating that Tae-hyun's judgment had been compromised by personal attachment to people who had no place in the organization's world. He talked about Han. He talked about two other council members whose names Tae-hyun recognized and filed. And in one recording dated 7 months ago, he talked about Cha Min-seok. Tae-hyun pulled out one earphone when he heard his father's name. He rewound the file 40 seconds and listened again, leaning forward slightly over the table, his whole body going still in the way it went when something required his absolute attention. Sung-kyu, on the recording, speaking to an unidentified second voice. The old man knew. In the last year, he knew. He confronted me directly, told me he had the account records, told me he was deciding what to do. And then he got sick, and then he got sicker, and then he died, and the records went with him. Or I thought they did. A pause on the recording, then, the boy doesn't know his father was protecting him. He thinks Min-seok was sentimental. He wasn't sentimental. He was buying time. He was waiting to see if the son was strong enough to handle it without being told. Tae-hyun sat back in his chair. His father had known for at least the last year of his life, which meant during those 14 months of hospital visits that Tae-hyun had not made, while he was managing his father's situation from a distance like a logistical problem, his father had been sitting on this, had been holding it, had been, in his own way, trying to determine whether to trust his son with it or whether the trust would break something that couldn't be fixed. And then he had died with it, and sent Tae-hyun to a children's center in Mapo and written 3 sentences in his own handwriting and left the answer inside the question. Go see what I was protecting. Try to understand it before you judge it. He hadn't meant just the center. He hadn't meant just Naomi and Ari and the 41 children. He had meant, go find out who you are when someone puts something human in front of you. Go find out if you're capable of protecting the right things. And when you've answered that, when you know whether you have what it takes to be more than what I made you, come back and deal with what I left unfinished. Tae-hyun sat in the gray pre-dawn light of his office and looked at the spread of documents on the table and understood for the first time and completely what his father had done. Not the cowardice he had assigned to it, not the sentimentality he had assumed. A test. Brutal and loving in equal measure, the way his father had always been. The way every choice the man had ever made had been, without apology and without the comfort of explicit explanation, because Cha Min-seok had believed that things you were handed directly were worth less than things you had to find yourself. He pressed the back of his fist against his mouth. He sat like that for a while. Then he straightened up, picked up his pen, and went back to work. Shem. The emergency council session was called for 9 o'clock Thursday morning. By 7:45, Mireille had the complete evidentiary package assembled: financial documentation, corporate registration trails, account records with annotated discrepancies, the corporate ownership structure of Daesong Urban Development, the surveillance operation contracts, the inspector's documented connection to Seong-kyu's network, and selected audio transcripts from Lee's recordings, formatted for presentation with timestamps and source documentation. It was 231 pages, and it was airtight. Tae-hyun read the final version at 8:15, made 4 corrections to the formatting, approved it, and had it printed in 9 copies, 1 for each council seat, 1 for himself. At 8:40, he went to the men's room off the main corridor, ran cold water over his hands, and looked at himself in the mirror for approximately 10 seconds. He had been awake for 31 hours. His eyes were clear. He was wearing a fresh suit. He kept 2 in his office for exactly this category of situation, and his face held the particular quality that appeared when he had moved fully past doubt into execution. He walked into the council chamber at 8:58 and took his seat at the head of the table. The 9 council members filed in over the next 4 minutes. Han Sung-jin came in third, moving with the careful dignity of a senior man who had no idea that this morning was different from any other morning. Seong-kyu came in last, at 9:02, which was itself a small statement. A man arriving on his own schedule, a man who had decided somewhere in the past several weeks that the schedule was becoming his to set. He sat. He looked at the bound document in front of him. They all did. Each one registered its presence. And then he looked at Tae-hyun with an expression of careful inquiry. "What's the agenda today?" he said. "1 item," Tae-hyun said. "Open the document." Nobody moved immediately. There was a collective hesitation, the particular quality of a room where several people know something is wrong, but have not yet determined whether to acknowledge it. Then, one by one, the council members opened the bound packet. Seung-kyu opened his. He read the first page. His expression did not change, and that was the tell, because a man encountering a financial document he had never seen before would show some response, however small. His face stayed absolutely still, which was the face of a man who had prepared for a version of this moment and was running his contingency. "This is a financial audit document," Seung-kyu said. "Who commissioned it?" "I did," Tae-hyun said. "Read page 7. I'd like to understand the context before page 7, Seung-kyu." The room was very quiet. Council members were reading, pages turning at different speeds, and Tae-hyun watched the faces. The moment each one hit the organizational chart, the moment the numbers registered, the moment the name appeared. He watched the faces of the two council members he knew Seung-kyu had approached, and he saw the specific expression of men realizing that the ground they thought was solid had just become something else entirely. Han Sung-jin turned to page 7, read it, and went gray. Seung-kyu set his document down. He looked at Tae-hyun across the table. His face had settled into something that was no longer performing calm, but was the actual absence of it. A flatness that came from rapid internal calculation, from a man running through exits and finding them. "This is a fabrication," he said. "It's source documentation," Tae-hyun said. "Every figure has an account reference. Every corporate entity is registered and traceable. The methodology is in the appendix if you want to verify the audit trail. Someone has constructed a false... There are also audio recordings." Tae-hyun said it without raising his voice. 18 months of recordings from your office. I have selected transcripts in the packet you're holding, but the full archive is available for any council member who wants to review it. He looked around the table. All of it. The room absorbed this. He watched it land. The word recordings, the word 18 months, the specific shift in posture that moved through the table like a current, as each man understood what that meant and what it covered and how far back it went. Seung-kyu's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough. "You're standing here with forged documents and illegal recordings to cover the fact that this organization's finances have deteriorated under your watch, that you have been distracted, compromised. Everyone in this room knows where your attention has been for the past 3 months." "Yes," Tae-hyun said. "Let's talk about that." Seung-kyu paused. The word "yes" had not been what he expected. "My attention has been in Mapo District," Tae-hyun said, "at a multicultural children's center run by a woman named Naomi Brooks, who my father anonymously supported for nearly 5 years. I have been visiting that center for 3 months. I have not concealed it." He looked around the table again, each face in sequence. "I was told this represented compromised judgment. I was told the organization had concerns about my leadership based on personal attachments to inappropriate external associations." He paused. "I want to be precise about what those associations actually are. They are a woman who builds things for children that other people won't build, and a 5-year-old girl who walked through this organization's soldiers at my father's funeral and took my hand because she had no understanding of why that should frighten her." He let that sit in the air for a moment. "I'm not ashamed of either of those things." Seung-kyu said, "You've confirmed everything we were concerned about." "No," Tae-hyun said. "I've confirmed that I'm capable of more than what this organization has traditionally required of its leaders. There's a difference." He opened his own copy of the document. "Now, 4.3 billion won, 11 years. Let's go through it." He went through it. He went through it the way Mireille had gone through it with him, methodically, from the outer edges in, each shell company, each routing mechanism, each falsified expense code. He went through the Daesung urban development connection. He went through the surveillance operation. He went through the inspector. He went through Han's parking structure meeting with a photograph pulled from the back of the packet, a still frame from the surveillance footage, crisp and specific and undeniable. Han said nothing. He looked at the photograph, and he looked at his hands, and he said nothing. Seung-kyu held for longer than Tae-hyun had expected. He raised procedural objections, the legitimacy of the recordings, the chain of custody on the financial documentation, the authority by which the audit had been commissioned. Each objection was answered. Tae-hyun had anticipated all of them. He had spent 31 sleepless hours anticipating all of them, and for each one he had the answer ready and sourced before Seong-kyu finished the sentence. The room was changing. He could feel it. The gradual shift in weight as the men who had been persuaded or pressured by Seong-kyu over the past months recalculated where the ground was, which direction it was tilting, and what the posture of survival looked like from here. He could see it in the way they held their documents, and the way they stopped looking at Seong-kyu for signals and started looking at Tae-hyun instead. Director Park Sang-il, who had not been among those Seong-kyu had reached, said, "How long have you been building this?" "Since the day after my father's funeral," Tae-hyun said. Park looked at Seong-kyu. Then he looked at the document. Then he said, "I move that the council vote on formal removal of Director Cho Seong-kyu from all organizational positions and refer the full financial documentation to internal disciplinary review." Seong-kyu's hand came down flat on the table. Not a slam. Controlled, deliberate, a physical punctuation. "You don't have the authority. This evidence was gathered through illegal—" "Second," said the director to Park's left without looking up from his document. "This is not—" "Third," said another voice. Seong-kyu stood up. His chair scraped back and he stood with both hands on the table and looked at Tae-hyun, and the controlled flatness was gone now, replaced by something unmediated and specific. Not fear exactly, but the thing fear becomes in men who have spent too long believing they were protected by their own intelligence. "You think this is leadership," he said, "running to a woman in Mappo, sitting with children, making decisions based on sentiment, on whatever you think your dead father wanted you to feel. Sit down, Seong-kyu. You have no idea what it takes to—" "Sit down." He didn't sit. He stood and breathed and looked at Tae-hyun across the table, and for the first time in 15 years, Tae-hyun could see the man clearly. Not the performance of the man, not the careful vocabulary and the arranged concern, but what was underneath it, which was a person who had decided a very long time ago that the only security worth having was the kind you built in secret, because nothing given openly could be trusted to last. Tae-hyun understood that. He understood the logic of it with a clarity that was almost physical, because he had lived inside a version of that logic his entire adult life. The version that kept people at arm's length, that managed rather than felt, that turned everything human into a variable to be controlled. The difference between them, he thought, was a 5-year-old girl in a paper crane and a woman in a green apron who had made him sit in an orange chair and wait, and had not apologized for it. "You stole 4.3 billion won from this organization," Tae-hyun said. "You targeted a children's center that my father spent the last years of his life supporting. You bribed a council member and corrupted a municipal inspector and commissioned surveillance on a woman and a child who have nothing to do with any operational reality of this organization. And you did all of it because you decided that caring about something outside of this building was a weakness you could exploit." He held Seong-kyu's gaze without blinking. "You were wrong about what weakness looks like." The vote was 6-2. Han abstained, which in its own way said everything. Seong-kyu's organizational access was revoked at the table. His building credentials were suspended by the security director who had been waiting outside the room with the authorization paperwork ready. 2 men who had served Tae-hyun personally were outside the chamber door, and when it opened, they walked Seong-kyu out with the quiet efficiency of people performing a task they had prepared for. He didn't fight it. That was the thing. At the end, with the votes cast and the documentation sitting in front of 9 men and his access to everything already cut, he walked out of the room with the careful composure of a man who had always known the game could end this way, and had simply believed until this morning that he was too smart for the ending to arrive. The door closed. The chamber was very quiet. 8 men remaining, some of them reading, some of them looking at the table. One of them, Han Sung-jin, looking at his hands with the expression of a man inventorying damage. Tae-hyun looked at Han. "You'll resign your position by end of day. The financial irregularities in your own account, and there are some, I've had them documented, will not be referred further if you do." Han's throat moved. "Yes," he said. "Just that." Tae-hyun closed his document. He looked at the remaining men. There are 41 children in a community center in Mappo district that was served with a fraudulent closure order. That order has a parallel legal challenge being filed as of this morning. I'm going to that center this afternoon. If anyone at this table has questions about the evidentiary package, Mireille Yoon will be available in conference room 2 until 6 o'clock. He stood. We're done. He walked out of the chamber. In the hallway, he stopped and stood against the wall for a moment. His hands were steady. His heart rate was elevated. Not dramatically, but measurably, the physical residue of 6 hours of sustained pressure. And he could feel the 31 sleepless hours in the specific heaviness behind his eyes and across his shoulders. He breathed, in and out, once, twice. His phone buzzed. Park and CO Associates. He answered. The stay was granted, said the attorney on the other end. Filed 40 minutes ago, judge signed it 22 minutes later. The closure order is suspended pending full review. We're filing the corruption documentation regarding the inspector's conflict of interest this afternoon, which should result in the underlying violations being vacated within the week. Good, he said. Thank you. He hung up and called Naomi. She answered before the first ring completed. Tell me. The stay was granted, he said. The center stays open. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds exactly. Then she said very quietly, Okay. And then, after another moment, Okay. I'll be there this afternoon, he said. I told you I would be. I know you did. Her voice had something in it he hadn't heard before. Not relief exactly, something more complex. The sound of a person who had held something at enormous cost and was only now, in this specific moment, allowing themselves to set it down. Tae-hyun. Yes. Whatever you did this morning, whatever it cost. She stopped. Started again. Thank you. He was about to answer when the elevator at the end of the corridor opened and Im Jae-won stepped out, moving fast, with the specific quality of controlled urgency that meant something had happened that required immediate attention. Sir? Jae-won reached him. His voice was low. Seong-kyu's security team. The private team, not the organizational one. They've been trying to reach him for the past 40 minutes and haven't been able to. Someone on that team just accessed the surveillance logs on the Hanul Center. He paused. And someone ordered a vehicle to the Mapo address 20 minutes ago. We don't know who made this, Tae-hyun said. Get my car. Now. He was already moving down the corridor before Jae-won finished acknowledging the order, his phone up, dialing Naomi. It rang 3 times. 4. He pushed through the stairwell door rather than waiting for the elevator and took the stairs at a pace that was not quite running but was everything short of it, the sound of his shoes on concrete echoing up the shaft. 5 rings. 6. She picked up on the 7th. I just got off with you 30 seconds. Leave the building, he said. Right now. Take Ari and leave through the back. Don't use the front entrance. Go to the laundromat on the corner of the next block and stay inside. A beat. 1 beat. Naomi Brooks did not waste time on questions when the information she'd been given was sufficient. How long? 20 minutes. Maybe less. There are other kids here. How many? 7. 3 parents are still in the building, 2 volunteers. Get everyone out the back. Tell them a gas leak. Tell them anything. Just move. He hit the parking level door and pushed through it. Naomi, move now. Moving, she said. And he heard her voice shift away from the phone, heard her say, calm, authoritative, zero panic. Hey everybody, we need to step outside for a few minutes. Back door, please. Let's go. Come on. And then the line cut as she pocketed the phone. His car was already pulled up, driver out, and holding the door. He got in. Jae-won slid in from the other side, 2 security vehicles behind them. What do we know? Tae-hyun said. The vehicle order came from a private number connected to one of Seong-kyu's external contractors. Not the surveillance team, different. We think it's the same unit he used for physical operations in the Incheon territory dispute last year. Jae-won's voice was level, but his hands, folded in his lap, were tight. 2 men, possibly 3. They were already in Mapo when the order was placed. They were staged, pre-positioned. Which meant Seong-kyu had set this in motion before the council session, as a contingency, as the thing that happened if the session went wrong. A man who had spent 11 years building contingencies had built one more, and it pointed at a woman and a child in a converted warehouse on a narrow street in Mapo district. ETA, Taehyun said. 14 minutes if traffic holds. He looked out the window. Traffic in Seoul at this hour held for nobody. Go through Mapo Bridge and tell the security team to move up. The driver moved up. The city slid past the windows in its ordinary and different way, and Taehyun sat in the back seat with his phone in his hand and did something he hadn't done in years. He sat with the fear rather than filing it. He let it be present. The specific cold weight of it, Naomi's voice on the phone going calm while she moved 7 children out a back door. Ari somewhere in that building. The image of a small hand taking his at a funeral. He let all of it sit in his chest without managing it, because there was nothing to do with it yet, and pretending it wasn't there would not make him more effective. It would make him less. He had learned that from watching Naomi work. The way she felt things and moved through them rather than around them. The way her competence and her emotion ran together rather than one suppressing the other. He had spent 34 years believing that the suppression was the skill. He was beginning to understand it was the liability. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't have saved. Back entrance, 2 minutes out. Don't call police. He stared at the text. Then he dialed the number. It rang once. Don't call police, the same voice said. Male, middle-aged, the flat tone of a man performing a task. Who authorized you? Taehyun said. A pause. You know who. Seong-kyu is no longer in a position to authorize anything. His organizational access was revoked 38 minutes ago. Another pause. Longer. That's not... We were briefed that... You were briefed on a contingency that no longer applies. Whatever you were told to do in that scenario, it's void. Seong-kyu is finished. If you proceed, you'll be proceeding on your own, with no organizational cover and no extraction support, against a target that my personal security team is now converging on. He kept his voice even. I'm telling you to stand down. I'm telling you once. Silence on the line. He heard breathing. He heard faintly the sound of a vehicle interior. A door, a muffled exchange between 2 people. We're standing down, the voice said. We weren't going to. It was meant to be a pressure play. Photographs. A warning. Leave Mapo, Taehyun said. Don't come back. He hung up. He didn't know if they would. He didn't trust that they would. He rode the remaining 6 minutes to Mapo in the same position, watching the streets, and when the car turned onto the narrow road, he was out before it fully stopped, moving toward the laundromat on the corner with the 2 security men from the vehicle behind him, keeping pace without being told to. The laundromat had a steamed-up front window and a bell above the door that rang when he pushed it open. Naomi was standing near the back between 2 industrial dryers, one hand on Ari's shoulder, the other holding her phone. 3 parents stood in a cluster near the folding tables, looking uncertain and vaguely alarmed. 2 volunteers sat against the wall. The 7 children were spread between the parents and a small bench near the window, with the particular resilience of children who had been told something was happening but hadn't been told what, and had decided that proximity to adults they trusted was sufficient for now. Ari saw him when he came through the door. She crossed the laundromat in 8 steps, quick, certain, the way she moved when she had decided something, and stopped directly in front of him and looked up. Her face was unreadable in the specific way her face got when she was managing something, an expression he recognized because it was almost identical to one Naomi made. There wasn't a gas leak, she said. No, he said. Was it because of you? He crouched down so he was at her level. The floor of the laundromat was slightly damp and his suit trousers were going to carry the evidence of this. He didn't care. Yes, he said. It was connected to something I was dealing with. It's been handled. She looked at him for a long moment with those large, steady eyes. Is it done now? Yes. She considered this. Then she stepped forward and put both arms around his neck, which she had not done before. All the previous physical contact had been her hand in his, brief and purposeful, but this was different. This was a child who had decided he was safe enough to hold, and it hit him somewhere behind his sternum with a force that was completely disproportionate to the physical reality of a 5-year-old's embrace and entirely proportionate to what it meant. He put one hand on her back, carefully, like something he didn't want to break. Over Ari's shoulder, he looked at Naomi. She was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before, Open in a way she didn't usually permit herself, the careful self-containment she wore like a second skin briefly absent. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The formal dissolution of Cho Seung-kyu's position was completed within 48 hours. His personal financial network, the Singapore entity, the 14 shells, the 4.3 billion won in accumulated theft, was subjected to a full internal audit and recovery proceedings. The Singapore entity was reported to the relevant authorities through channels that were deliberately legitimate, because Tae-hyun had decided that the exposure needed to be real and permanent rather than managed through the organization's usual methods. Some of that money would never be recovered. Most of it would. The recovery process would take years, and he knew it and accepted it. Han Sung-jin submitted his resignation the same evening as the council session. He sent it by letter, handwritten, which had the quality of a man choosing a form that felt appropriate to the magnitude of what he was acknowledging. Tae-hyun read it and filed it and did not respond. Lee Byung-ho was relocated and reassigned to a position that put significant distance between him and anyone connected to Seung-kyu's former network. The reassignment came with a recognition that was not formal and was not announced, because the organization didn't work in formal public announcements, but it was real, and Lee understood it was real, which was what mattered. The inspector, Park Chul-ho, was referred to the Municipal Ethics Commission through the documentation that Park and Seo submitted alongside the stay challenge. He resigned from his position before the formal investigation concluded. The Hanwoo Center's fabricated safety violations were officially vacated 11 days after the closure order was issued. The center received a clean compliance certification from an independent assessment firm 3 weeks after that. Daesung Urban Development's rezoning application was withdrawn. The consortium dissolved its MAPO holdings within the month, and the building that housed the Hanwoo Center signed a 5-year lease renewal at terms that were unexpectedly favorable, arranged through a property negotiation that Naomi handled herself with a lawyer she trusted, without asking Tae-hyun's involvement. He didn't offer it. She told him about the lease renewal on a Thursday, sitting in the center's front room with their respective cups of tea, with the building quiet around them, because the day's programs had ended and the last child had been collected an hour ago. 5 years, she said, guaranteed. Good, he said. She looked at him. I want you to know I did it myself. I know you did. I wasn't involved. I know you weren't. She turned her cup in her hands. I checked. Something moved in his expression that was almost amusement. You checked. I checked, because I needed to know. She set the cup down. And I needed to know that you'd let me. He was quiet for a moment. Did you think I wouldn't? 6 months ago? I didn't know you well enough to be sure. She met his eyes directly. Now I'm sure. The room held its quiet. Outside, the narrow street had gone dark, the evening sounds settling into their familiar register. Somewhere in the back of the building, Ari was doing homework at the small table she'd claimed as her personal territory, a task she was performing with audible low-level commentary directed at nobody in particular. There's something I haven't told you, Tae-hyun said. Naomi waited. My father knew about Seung-kyu. In the last year, he knew what Seung-kyu was doing. He had the account records. He looked at the window. He chose not to confront it directly. He was managing it, and then he ran out of time to finish managing it, and he died with it unresolved. He paused. He sent me here because he needed me to become capable of handling it. The note, the center, all of it. It was the preparation, not the destination. Naomi was quiet for a long moment. That's an enormous amount to carry, she said finally. It's less than it was. Because you handled it? Because I understand it now. He looked at her. He wasn't a kind man, but he wasn't only what I decided he was. He was a person who had built things he couldn't dismantle and loved things he couldn't say directly and ran out of time before he figured out how to close the distance. He stopped. I understand that better than I did. Because of you, Naomi said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer it directly. He looked at his hands, which were resting on his knees, the hands that had held a paper crane and a glue stick and a 5-year-old girl's weight against his chest. I spent 34 years being what the organization required, he said. I was good at it. I still am. But I spent those years deciding that anything I couldn't control was a variable to be managed, and anyone I couldn't keep at a distance was a liability. He paused. I thought that was strength. I think it was a very well-constructed version of fear. Naomi looked at him steadily. What changed? He thought about the orange chair. He thought about waiting 22 minutes without an apology. He thought about a paper crane that was a little smooshed, but you could see what it was. You made me wait, he said. The first day. You made me sit in a chair that was too small, and you made me wait for 22 minutes because you were finishing what you were doing. And nobody had made me wait for anything in approximately a decade. He looked at her. Sounds like a small thing. It wasn't, she said. No, it wasn't. He turned his cup in his hands. You treated me like a person who needed to wait his turn. Not a threat, not an asset, not an authority, a person. He was quiet for a moment. I don't know when I stopped expecting that. Naomi reached across the small table between them and put her hand over his. Not dramatically, not with the weight of declaration, just set it there warm and still, the way she did things, direct and without performance. I knew who you were when I let you back through the door, she said. I'm not saying I knew everything, but I knew enough. And I let you back anyway because she started again. Because Ari trusted you, and Ari has never been wrong about a person. She's 5, he said. She's 5 and she's never been wrong. Naomi's mouth curved. Don't argue with the data. Something happened in his face that was fully a smile. Not the precursor of one, not the memory of one, but the actual thing, unexpected and slightly unfamiliar on the specific muscles it required. It lasted only a moment, and then it settled back into the quieter expression that lived beneath it. But it had been there, and Naomi had seen it, and she filed it somewhere she planned to keep. The annual Multicultural Festival happened on the second Saturday of the following month. The center's courtyard had been transformed over the course of the previous week by a committee that consisted of 6 parents, 4 volunteers, 11 children who had strong opinions about the placement of the paper lanterns, and Ari, who served as the committee's de facto aesthetic director and exercised this role with considerable confidence. The lanterns went up in the arrangement Ari specified. The banner, trilingual, Naomi's careful calligraphy alongside a Nigerian-Korean parent's brushwork and a Vietnamese grandmother's embroidery, stretched across the courtyard entrance. Tables ran along both sides with food from 7 countries, each dish labeled in the language of the family that brought it. Tae-hyun arrived at 11 in the morning. 1 vehicle, no escort. He wore dark trousers and a simple gray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, which was the closest he got to informal, and which Naomi had once told him looked almost like a real person's clothes, a comment he had turned over in his head for 3 days before deciding it was a compliment. He stood at the courtyard entrance for a moment and looked at it. Children moved between the tables and the open center space, where a woman was teaching a traditional drumming pattern to a group of 6-year-olds with more enthusiasm than precision. Parents talked in the cluster and spread pattern of adults at community events. The lanterns moved slightly in the November air, their light warm and specific against the gray of the late autumn sky. He had not stood in a place that looked like this since before he could clearly remember. Ari found him in approximately 45 seconds, which was how long it took her to cross the courtyard from the far side where she had been supervising something. She was wearing a dress that had been specifically selected for the occasion. He could tell because it was neater than her usual clothes and had a small lantern embroidered on the pocket, which she showed him immediately upon arrival, turning the pocket toward him with the gravity of someone presenting significant information. We made these, she said. Me and Hanasi. The lantern is me. He looked at the embroidered lantern. It looks like you. She considered whether this was satisfactory and decided it was. Come on, she said, and took his hand in the easy, certain way she always had, and walked him into the courtyard. He spent 2 hours at the festival. He ate food he didn't recognize at a table where a Nigerian-Korean grandmother explained each dish to him in a combination of Korean and English that somehow communicated everything it needed to. He sat beside a 7-year-old boy named Marcus, who was teaching himself to fold origami fish, and who accepted Tae-hyun's assistance without comment and without gratitude, which was its own kind of respect. He helped carry 2 long tables from the storage room to the courtyard, when an impromptu expansion of the food area required them, because he was there and he was capable and nobody had asked. And so he did it, which was a category of behavior he was still learning the grammar of, but was getting better at. He watched Naomi move through the festival the way he had watched her move through the center for months, present everywhere, fully, without the performance of omnipresence. She stopped at every cluster of people long enough to mean it. She laughed 3 times in the 2 hours, each time at something that was actually funny, the unguarded laugh that he had cataloged early and returned to often. She found him twice in the crowd to check something practical, once about the table placement, once to ask if he could hold a box of supplies for 30 seconds, which expanded to 4 minutes, which she apologized for when she came back and he said there was no need to apologize. And she looked at him with a brief private smile that was different from the ones she wore for the room. Around 1 in the afternoon, the drumming workshop concluded and the courtyard settled into a quieter register, the festival's energy converting from the kinetic to the social. Children began the winding down negotiations of tired and happy. Parents started the packing up maneuvers of people who had stayed longer than they planned and were glad of it. Ari reappeared at Taehyun's side with both hands behind her back and an expression of careful premeditation. She had been working towards something. He could tell from the approach, the particular quality of her attention. "I made you something," she said. "Yes," he said. She brought her hands from behind her back. A paper crown. Constructed from the gold and red festival paper that had lined the food tables, folded and assembled with considerable effort and structural ambition, decorated around the edges with small drawn stars and what appeared to be a tiger, which was Ari's recurring motif across approximately 40% of her artwork. "It's for the quiet man," she said. It was what she had called him in the beginning, and she had never stopped. He had come to understand it was not a diminishment. It was her name for him, the thing that distinguished him from other people in her private taxonomy, the specific quality she had noticed first and decided mattered. He crouched down. She placed the crown on his head with both hands, with the focused seriousness of a ceremony. "There," she said, and stepped back to assess. She tilted her head. "It's a little crooked." "Is it the important kind of crooked?" She considered. "No, you can see what it is." He stayed crouched for a moment longer, at her eye level, and looked at her. This child who had walked through 63 armed men with no understanding of why she should be afraid, who had taken his hand at a funeral and set something in motion that he could not have predicted and would not undo. He looked at her face, which was open and certain and completely unguarded, and he thought about all the things that had to be true for this specific moment to exist. His father standing in an alley with his fist against his mouth, a woman from Atlanta who had chosen to stay, 57 wire transfers routed through 3 accounts, a paper crane that was a little smooshed, and a man who had spent 34 years building walls, discovering that the most important thing he would ever do was sit in an orange chair and wait. "Thank you," he said. Ari nodded, satisfied, and went back to the courtyard. He stood. He straightened, a hand briefly touching the paper crown to check its angle, and when he looked up, Naomi was there, a few feet away, having arrived in the quiet way she had of appearing in his vicinity when something had just happened that she'd seen. She looked at the crown on his head. She looked at his face. "You're wearing a paper crown," she said. "Yes." "In public?" "Apparently." She pressed her lips together against a smile that won anyway. "How is it?" He thought about it. "Slightly crooked," he said, "but you can see what it is." She looked at him for a moment, the full, direct look that she gave to things she was deciding about. And then she walked toward him and stopped close enough that he could see the fine line at the corner of her eyes where the cold November air had dried the skin, could see the small scar above her left eyebrow he'd noticed months ago and never asked about, could see all the specific human detail of a face he had been memorizing without meaning to for the better part of a year. "I want to tell you something," she said. "And I want you to just hear it without immediately figuring out what to do with it." He held still. "Okay. You didn't earn my trust by doing things for us. You didn't earn it with the lawyers or the legal strategy or any of the things you were careful to keep your hands off of." She held his eyes without wavering. "You earned it by coming back, every Thursday, for months, when there was nothing in it for you. No leverage, no return, no strategic value. Just coming back." She paused. "That's not nothing. For someone like you, someone who has spent his whole life doing things that have a return, That is not nothing. He said quietly, "It didn't feel like a decision." "I know," she said. "That's the point." She reached out and took his hand, the same hand Ari had taken at the funeral, the same hand that had held a glue stick and a paper crane and the weight of a sleeping child's trust, and held it the way she held things, without ceremony, without performance, simply and completely, the way someone holds something they have decided is theirs to hold. Around them, the festival continued its winding down. Children chased each other between the tables. The lanterns swayed in the November air. The woman who had been teaching drumming was now sitting on a low wall eating jian and talking to two parents who were laughing at something she'd said. The courtyard smelled like sesame oil and cold air and the particular warmth of people who have spent hours together and have run out of reasons to leave. Taehyun stood in the middle of it with a paper crown on his head and Naomi's hand in his, and looked at the courtyard. At Ari threading between adults with something tucked under her arm, already halfway to her next project, already moving forward in the certain way she moved through the world that was entirely her own, and felt, without managing it, or filing it, or converting it into anything useful, the full weight of what his father had sent him here to find. Not the organization, not the strategy, not the proof of his own capability. This, the particular feeling of standing in a place where you were not the most powerful person present and not minding. The specific warmth of a hand that held yours because it wanted to, not because it had to. The sound of children who knew your name. His father had stood in this courtyard, or stood in the alley beside it, and had felt the ghost of something like this, the distant shape of what might have been possible if his life had bent differently, and it had broken something open in him that he hadn't known was sealed. And he had driven home and picked up a phone and started the wire transfers, because it was what he knew how to do, and because giving money was the closest he knew how to get to giving himself, and because it was the last and most honest thing that the man who had built an empire on controlled distance could offer to something that required the opposite. Taehyun understood this now. He carried it not as grief, not exactly, but as the particular knowledge of a man who has recognized himself in another person's failing and chosen differently. He was still who he was. He would still run the organization with the cold precision that his father had identified in him at 16. He would still sit across tables from dangerous men and hold their gaze without flinching. He would still make decisions that existed outside the ordinary ledger of right and wrong, because that was the world he moved in and he had never pretended otherwise. But he would come back here on Thursdays. He would sit in the orange chair. He would hold glue sticks and paper cranes and the small, careful trust of a child who had never once been afraid of him. He would stand beside this woman and let her see his face and not manage what she found there. He would do all of it not because it made him better at what he was, but because it made him more than what he was. And there was a difference, and his father had spent 5 years and 57 wire transfers trying to tell him so. Ari looked back from across the courtyard and saw him standing there with the crown on his head and Naomi's hand in his, and she gave him the small evaluative nod of a person whose assessment has been confirmed and turned back to whatever she was doing. He tightened his hand around Naomi's just slightly. She tightened back. The lanterns moved in the cold air above them, gold and red and warm against the gray November sky, and the courtyard held its noise and its life and its complete indifference to the fact that anything extraordinary had happened here at all, which was exactly right, which was exactly how it should be, because the most important things always happened in ordinary places among ordinary sounds, and the only people who knew were the ones who had been paying attention.